In 1945, Nazi Germany still demanded absolute loyalty from men who could already hear the war ending. The paradox was brutal and mechanical. The Wehrmacht had been built to move fast and dominate through discipline and momentum, but in the last winter it was reduced to static defense, collapsing supply lines, and units that often existed more on paper than on the ground. Yet the regime's enforcement of obedience became sharper, not softer. Because when an army is losing, the only thing more fragile than the front line is the story that holds it together. Desertion was not merely treated as absence. It was treated as an attack on the state's final remaining rapport manpower. Military courts and tribunals sentenced an estimated 18,000 to 20,000 German soldiers, sailors, and airmen to death for desertion and related offenses under Nazi military justice. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the final months of the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. To understand the dark truth about German soldiers who deserted in 1945, the story has to begin earlier than the collapse itself, back in the mental architecture of the Third Reich's war. The Wehrmacht's concept of discipline was never only military, it was political. A soldier's oath and the culture built around it were intended to be stronger than fatigue, stronger than hunger, stronger than fear, and eventually stronger than reality. By the time the Reich faced strategic defeat, desertion became the clearest measurement that ideology could no longer force the human body to keep going. By late 1944, Germany's battlefield problems were not abstract. They were physical. Fuel was scarce. Trucks were immobilized for lack of gasoline. Rail lines were broken by bombing and retreat. Factories still produced weapons, but production no longer guaranteed delivery. And as the Eastern Front collapsed toward the Oder, and the Western Allies broke into the Reich itself, the German state's response was to widen coercion rather than accept contraction. The Volkssturm was called up in October 1944, an emergency militia meant to fill gaps with boys and old men, often with minimal training and limited weapons. It was the bureaucratic admission that the regular force was no longer sufficient. But this documentary's focus is not the Volkssturm's battlefield value. It is what their existence symbolized for everyone still in uniform. The war was being fought by whoever could still stand. And once the war becomes that, desertion changes shape. It is no longer simply a soldier slipping away from a unit. It becomes a mass phenomenon of collapse. Men surrendering at the first opening, disappearing into forests and ruins, stripping insignia, trying to become civilians again in a country where the line between civilian and soldier had already been erased. By 1945, the system built to prevent that disappearance had an identifiable steel face. The Feldgendarmerie, the Wehrmacht's military police, operated behind the lines with authority that grew harsher as defeat approached. Their duties ranged from traffic control and population control to rear area security and anti-partisan actions. But by the later war years, they were increasingly tasked with holding the Wehrmacht together through fear. Ordinary soldiers called them Kettenhunde, chain dogs, a name linked to the metal gorget worn on duty, an emblem that functioned like armor for authority and a target for resentment. The mechanism of enforcement was designed for speed. In occupied Europe and in rear areas, the Feldgendarmerie supported forms of rapid military justice, including flying court-martials that could impose death sentences with sweeping authority. It was an attempt to keep the war machine from bleeding personnel faster than it could recruit them. In a retreat, roads become arteries. Bridges become valves. Crossroads become choke points where every truck, every wounded column, every exhausted group of stragglers is forced to compress into a narrow space. That is where military police can turn movement into control, checking passes, separating men from units, deciding who is authorized to be alive outside the front line. And in 1945, the geography of collapse meant those choke points were everywhere. The Eastern Front, by January 1945, had reached Germany proper, with Soviet forces advancing toward the Oder and closing to within roughly 100 miles of Berlin. In mid-April, the Soviet final assault began. Vienna fell April 13th. Berlin was encircled April 21st, and the link-up with American forces at Torgau on the Elbe on April 25th cut the Reich in half. When Berlin surrendered on May 2nd, the center of command was already dead, and the fronts were no longer fronts so much as dissolving boundaries of movement and surrender. On the western side, the physical logic of desertion was different, but equally inevitable. The U.S. and British armies drove into Germany with intact supply systems, fuel pipelines, and a logistical rhythm that made German resistance increasingly hopeless wherever it was attempted. Large formations were trapped and forced into mass surrender. When the war becomes an equation of time, how long until your position is surrounded? How long until the last artillery ammunition is gone? How long until the wounded can no longer be moved? Desertion becomes a grim form of calculation. It is the individual attempting to reach the end of the war alive by abandoning the unit before the unit is destroyed. Yet the Reich's late-war discipline system treated that calculation as betrayal. This is the core contradiction of 1945. The state was demanding continued sacrifice precisely when it could no longer provide the material conditions that make obedience possible. In earlier years, discipline is reinforced by operational success, mail from home, rotations, functioning medical evacuation, predictable rations, and the belief that suffering has a purpose. In 1945, the purpose was gone, but the punishments remained. As German territory shrank, the rear area disappeared. Military police functions moved closer to the front, and the front moved into towns, rail yards, bridges, and refugee columns. The countryside filled with displaced civilians, retreating units, wounded men, and fragmented detachments trying to reform. In that congestion, desertion could be as simple as stepping out of a marching column at night and not stepping back in. It could be a soldier letting himself be overtaken by civilians, then trading a helmet for a coat. It could be a man who still carried a rifle but no longer had a unit, because the unit was gone. And there was another pressure that made desertion in 1945 different from earlier in the war. The knowledge of what surrender might mean, depending on the direction. Soviet captivity carried its own terror, rooted in the savage realities of the Eastern Front. The war in the East had been fought as a war of annihilation, with massive civilian killing, collective punishment, and catastrophic mortality among Soviet prisoners of war earlier in the conflict. Those facts were known in fragments and rumors among German troops. Fear traveled down the line faster than orders. By the final months, many tried to reach Western Allied forces instead, an attempt to choose the captivity they believed they could survive. This is where the dark truth sharpens. Desertion in 1945 was often not political resistance in the heroic sense later imagined in memorial debates. For many, it was war weariness, fear, homesickness, family crisis, an exhausted human response to an unwinnable situation. Scholarship emphasizing deserter motivations highlights precisely that. Most deserters were not driven chiefly by ideology, but by the need to survive. But survival, under the collapsing Reich, had to be pursued in an environment where the state still possessed instruments of coercion. Even as Germany disintegrated, it still had guns, courts, uniforms, and men whose job was to enforce obedience. It could still kill its own soldiers. And in the last weeks, that capacity became concentrated and arbitrary because procedure breaks down under retreat. When lines collapse, documents vanish, offices burn, and communications fail, a legal system becomes faster and less accountable. The death sentence becomes easier to issue because there is less time to question it. The Feldgendarmerie's reputation, chain dogs, was built on this function. They were feared not because they were omnipresent, but because they appeared at the worst moments, at roadblocks behind the front, at bridges clogged with wagons, in towns where wounded men tried to hide in hospitals, where stragglers tried to join any passing unit to avoid being labeled deserters. One later nickname recorded in descriptions of their harsh policing was Heldenklauer, hero snatcher, because they screened refugees and hospital transports for potential deserters and suspected malingerers. The steel gorget and the paperwork were not decorations. They were tools to decide whether a man's movement was legitimate. In the final months, the Reich's manpower crisis was not only a matter of casualties, it was also a matter of evaporation. Every soldier who disappeared was one less rifle in a trench, one less body to hold a street corner, one less crewman to fire a gun that was already short of ammunition. From the regime's perspective, desertion threatened a chain reaction. As soon as some men left, others saw the possibility of leaving. Discipline, once cracked, can shatter quickly, especially when defeat is visible. That is why the system punished desertion so severely and publicly. The state needed examples. At the same time, the act of enforcing discipline also consumed manpower. Military police units had to be staffed, equipped, transported, fed, and given authority. In 1945, even that apparatus was strained. A collapsing transportation network meant fewer controlled choke points and more uncontrolled movement. Bombing and artillery made roads hazardous, rail lines uncertain, and supply convoys vulnerable. In such a landscape, discipline had to be enforced locally, often violently, because the center could no longer coordinate it. While German forces were surrendering unconditionally, west on May 7th and east on May 9th, violence around desertion could still occur even as the war formally ended. The fact that deserter executions could happen as late as May 1945 underscores the regime's final obsession. Not simply fighting the enemy, but preventing the internal collapse of obedience right up to the moment the state ceased to exist. And across the Reich, the landscape of 1945 was filled with forced movement, because the collapsing German state moved everyone it still controlled, not only soldiers, but prisoners. In the winter and spring of 1945, as Soviet forces advanced, German authorities forced tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war to march westward in extreme winter conditions. From a total of 257,000 Western Allied POWs held in German camps, over 80,000 were forced onto marches across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany between January and April 1945. Malnutrition, contaminated water, exhaustion, and exposure turned these movements into deadly journeys, while the chaos of war also created moments where lines between guard, prisoner, deserter, and civilian could blur into the same freezing road. This matters because it shows the broader mechanics of the Reich's final months. The state could no longer hold territory, but it could still compel movement. It could still push human beings down roads in columns, POWs marching west, refugees fleeing east or west, soldiers retreating, military police blocking roads, and, inside that crush, deserters trying to slip out of the machine. The dark truth is not that desertion existed. Desertion exists in every industrial war. The dark truth is the timing and the response. In 1945, Germany's war was already decided, but Nazi military justice continued to treat departure as the ultimate threat. The regime's obsession with avoiding a repeat of 1918's perceived collapse from within fused ideology with discipline. It created a condition where men could be asked to die for a war that was already lost, and could be killed by their own side if they refused to continue. In post-war memory, that produced a long conflict over meaning. Deserters were variously condemned as traitors or reinterpreted as resistors, depending on the politics of the era and the needs of public remembrance. But the historical record, where it can be reconstructed, points repeatedly to an uncomfortable reality. Many deserters were not trying to make a statement. They were trying to survive. And the system that hunted them was not improvising cruelty. It was applying the Reich's logic with increasing speed as the state collapsed. The war ended with surrender, but the machinery that had demanded loyalty did not dissolve instantly in every place. Germany's unconditional surrender in the West came May 7th, and in the East May 9th, 1945. In those final hours, the contrast was stark. The industrial war machine that once rolled across Europe was now an exhausted flow of men and vehicles, choked in rubble and fuel shortages, while its internal police forces still attempted to enforce discipline, as if control alone could change the strategic outcome. When historians look back at 1945, desertion becomes less a footnote than a diagnostic signal. It shows the moment when a state's narrative of inevitability failed at the level that matters most: individual bodies refusing to continue. It also shows that even in collapse, coercive systems can still function locally. Enough to kill, enough to terrify, enough to leave scars on memory long after the front lines are gone. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.